First, Tristan Garrell-Jones, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Although I was brought up in a Spanish-speaking country, if I may, I'll follow the example of Minister Cárdenas and address you all in English. One of my continuing frustrations, because of my interest in Latin America, has been the extent to which, in an increasingly global village, Latin America never has, to date, punched its weight at an international level. And one of the reasons why I regard the Pacific Alliance as one of the most important events that's happened in Latin America in the last 50 years is because I feel and hope that this alliance could be the kernel around which Latin America eventually comes together. And picking up the point made by Minister Amorim, who could have imagined back in the 1950s when 6 countries founded what was then called the Common Market, which was a free trade agreement between 6 countries, that we would have ended up where we are today with 28 members and all of us together punching our weight in international matters. So my dream, if you like, is that 50 years from now, even those countries looking out onto the Atlantic, and some of them have no mention of any names, some of them have a bit of a journey to do before they're ready, will eventually join this alliance. But coming to more practical matters about how the alliance should function now, we were very honored on Friday to be addressed by President Santos, and he made what I think is a hugely legitimate point, that he doesn't want to see the Pacific Alliance dominated by some massive bureaucracy. And I agree with that, and let me make a confession here. I have a criminal past in the sense that I used to be a politician. And but I'm now, by the way, an honest man. I'm an investment banker and chairman of UBS for Latin America. So I'm very much aware of how President Santos is thinking, because if you look at the European Union today, the Commission employs directly 22,000 officials, not to mention the people that it employs indirectly, and much of the anxieties in countries like my own and France about the European Union is because they see this massive bureaucracy imposing legislation and regulations upon them. So to that extent, I agree very much with President Santos. But having said that, it will be necessary, if I may say so, for this new treaty to have some kind of secretariat that supervises what's going on. For example, in international trade, there's a phrase called non-tariff barriers. That's a polite way of saying cheating. And you need a secretariat or an authority so that if an exporter, let's say from Mexico to Colombia or vice versa, finds that his products are being impeded in some way or another, he needs to be able to appeal to a body that can make a ruling. And ditto for countries in the Pacific or other parts of the world with whom they have bilateral trade agreements. If there is non-tariff barriers, someone needs to be able to rule. So you need that sort of bureaucracy. The trick, of course, is not to do what the European Union has done, which is to give that bureaucracy the power to make legislative initiatives. Those, of course, I think at least in the short term should rest with the individual countries. And one last example, which we heard yesterday by a prominent Colombian businessman, Mr. Bojanini, about the union of the stock exchanges. Well, yes, but even now, those 4 stock exchanges are still regulated by their own national regulations. And in my current position, I know a number of investors, quite big investors, who would like to invest in this part of the world, but don't, because they say, well, there's no liquidity. Because most big investors will only invest in packets of, say, $5 million or $10 million. And I think, again, you need a supervisory body that makes those 4 stock exchanges become a reality. So I think in the short term, we're all right across the world very keen to see this Pacific Alliance prospering. And in my own case, I retain the dream that one day it will be the kernel around which the whole of Latin America unites? Thank you.
Felipe Larraín of Chile.
Thank you, John. The issue of SMEs has been discussed over these 2 days very widely. And Mr. Lee mentioned particularly the issue of SMEs as an important point. Though I would like to know, because we know how the obstacles that SMEs face in taking advantage of opportunity.
Felipe, can you just speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Sure. We know how the obstacles that SMEs face, access to credit, financial markets, connectivity. Many times the most that an SME can aspire to is to be a supplier to a company that is exporting or that is trading overseas. So my question here is to the panel, but especially to the Asian members of the panel, is what concretely are you doing in your countries to enable SMEs to take advantage of the trans-Pacific opportunities?
Ms. Wu? Yep.
Yes, Beatriz Leisegui from Mexico. Well, he gave me my... Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Beatriz Leisegui from Mexico. I would like to make a question to Celso Amorim. And my question would be based in two conditions. The first one would be that the Pacific Alliance countries flexibilize their prerequisites to become part of the Pacific Alliance, and in the sense that you don't have to have a free trade agreement with the four in order to become a member. And the second condition would be, and I understand this can be so, that Brazil could negotiate separately from Mercosur with the Pacific Alliance. I know that, for example, Uruguay has done that. We have a free trade agreement with Uruguay. So if that is the case in the situation of Brazil, what would be your view with regard to the possible integration of Brazil to the Pacific Alliance?
Peter Rashish.
Thank you, John. That question anticipated mine, but let me just dig a little deeper. I think it points to the fact that while the Pacific Alliance is sort of very loose and sui generis, and Mercosur is much more modeled on the European Union, it's a customs union, it negotiates free trade agreements in principle as a group. I think what this previous questioner was pointing to is that when there are non-tariff issues under consideration, each member of Mercosur should in principle be able to take its own initiatives. And it seems to me that that would be one area for further integration in the hemisphere, and that would be for Brazil, for example, to negotiate in areas related to regulation, standards, investments with Colombia and the other members of the alliance. And those kinds of measures could particularly facilitate greater SME involvement in those markets. And so I just wondered, both asking Minister Cartagean and Minister Amorim, whether these are the kinds of things that would be welcomed and we could expect.
Thank you. Mr. Wang?
Thank you. There's a saying that 21st century is a century of Asia Pacific. But it is only Pacific Airlines. There's no Asian Airlines. So how to cooperate? Recently, fortunately, there's a Chinese or the Asian version of the Asian Airlines. That's so-called the Maritime Silk Road initiative by Chinese government. Which,
sorry, what initiative?
Huh?
Which initiative?
A Maritime Silk Road initiative. Because there's no Asian airlines, as I said. So combined together, the key also is mutual connectivities, as the Indonesia panelists argue, that trade, transportation policy, and currency, and people-to-people exchange connections. These work together with Pacific Airlines can serve for the dream of the FTAAP, free trade areas in Asia Pacific. But I would like to ask the Indonesian and the Singapore panelists, what's the challenges and difficulties or obstacles to build the Maritime Silk Road? And for the Brazil's concern, because you are not a Pacific nation. And China has another initiative. We want to build the railway, connect Asia, Pacific and Atlantic. And what's the obstacles and challenges for, in your understanding, which is good for bringing Brazil and other countries into Pacific Airlines and connect with each other? Thank you.
And from Chile, Manfred Wilhelmi.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman.
A bit closer to the microphone.
Yeah, and congratulations to the IASS and to our Colombian hosts for a truly great meeting. We have been really learning a lot during all these sessions. Since Minister Cárdenas is the sole Pacific Alliance representative in this panel, I would like to ask him what could be done so that the Pacific Alliance will take deeper roots in our respective societies. In a meeting like this and in many other seminars, it is more the specialists, the policymakers, important business people, etc., who exchange views. But so far, I see that in our civil societies, the Pacific Alliance has not really taken deep roots, and maybe Minister Cárdenas has some ideas on that question.
Good. Well, I think I'll return now to the panel, and perhaps first start with Mauricio Cárdenas. You want to respond to some of the points you've had?
So I'll touch on these two issues, which is what else can be done to make the Pacific Alliance, I guess, have deeper roots in our societies and become a more prominent and dominant force. And also on the question of what kind of initiatives can be taken to expand the Pacific Alliance. The first thing I say is the Pacific Alliance is something relatively recent. It is new. We are still in the first stages. What is really common about the countries that are members of the Pacific Alliance is really an integration of the private sector, which was a key force behind the Pacific Alliance. I think the private sector was actually leading the way. There's large investment from Chile in Colombia, from Mexico in Colombia, from Colombia in Peru. Trade is also very important. The integration of the stock exchanges is something that preceded, the initiative preceded the formal creation of the Pacific Alliance. So it's a private business community that really has promoted the integration. Why has that been the case? There is no doubt that there is a convergence of views and convergence of economic models based on very responsible macroeconomic management, but also very open economies. We all were very open to the rest of the world before we decided to form this alliance. The alliance does not exclude. It is not defined by exclusion. It is open. And we have a number of criteria in different areas of, for that to take place. One is basically that common perspective, common view. Here in the audience are two former finance ministers of the Pacific Alliance countries, Miguel Castilla from Peru, Felipe Larraín from Chile. And when we actually met, we met many times to discuss the future of the Pacific Alliance from our areas, which is basically finance. We said we have to have clear rules. For example, we exchange tax information following OECD criteria and standards. Other members will also be required to do that, to exchange in an automatic way tax information. So these are the standards we're building for the expansion of the Pacific Alliance. Let me say one thing about the future, where it's going. The world in general, and Asian countries in particular, China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, are very interested in investing in infrastructure in our countries. So one of the next steps we're promoting is an infrastructure fund that will invest in projects throughout the 4 countries of the Alliance of the Pacific. So investors would like to put money into these vehicles so that they'll invest in infrastructure projects and diversify the risk across these 4 countries. These are the type of issues we're promoting. And as I said, these are standards we're adopting, and the Pacific. And let me be very emphatic about this. The Pacific Alliance is not defined by exclusion. It's not excluding. It is really open, but it's open to, of course, individual countries that want to be part of it and that have these standards that we have agreed to.
Could you answer Tristan Garrell-Jones's point about the MILA?
Yes. So the MILA, for those of you that are not familiar, MILA is Mercado Integrado Latinoamericano. It included in the first stage the stock exchanges of Santiago, Lima, and Colombia. These stock exchanges were integrated in the way that you could do transactions with essentially stock in any of the 3 markets by just placing your order locally through your own stockbroker. Now Mexico is joining. Mexico had to do a reform in terms of legal change, but Mexico is now becoming part of it. Next step, trading not just of equities, but also of fixed-term instruments. And very importantly, if you place an IPO in one of these 4 markets, then you can trade immediately that IPO in the other stock markets. And in the future, and this is our vision, and very much share with Miguel and Felipe, is that we will treat investments in our respective countries as domestic investments from the point of view of the asset allocation of institutional investors, such as pension funds. So it will be considered as local. And this is very important because it opens the door for much larger flows of capital across these 4 countries.
Celso Amorim.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Glad you gave me the floor now because I think it has to do directly with the South America and Latin America. First, let me tell my good friend, Garrell Jones, with whom I had the privilege to interact when I was ambassador in London. Honestly, when you try to compare what happened with the European Union, I would say that the Pacific Alliance, so far, it may change, is much further from what the European Union is or intends to be than Mercosur. I would start with, we had a great discussion when Mercosur was started, whether we should try to have a common external tariff. And it's a big if. You might say that there are pros and cons in the two things. But because we put unity above everything else, because of the story of rivalries and so on that we wish to put behind us, we decided that we should have a customs union. Because, mind you, free trade areas come and go. I mean, who knows what is the EFTA nowadays? You have probably few people in this room who will be able to say what the EFTA is. And it was the European Free Trade Association by opposition to the common market. So our ambition was to have a common external tariff. So that creates some difficulties in having a totally free agreement with countries that have different policies and, of course, had lower tariffs than we used to have. In spite of that, we have free trade agreements with all the countries of South America that are members of the Pacific Alliance, so trying to put together. Second, I would say that, again, in Mercosur, although very important, and I agree with someone who said that the non-tariff barriers are terrible. I have many stories that I would be able to tell, which I will spare you, but I could tell you that integration certainly is not something that you decide on the books. Also, you have to have good laws and good rules, but it's a daily basis. You have every day to see if the bureaucrats and other people are not creating problems. Thirdly, I would say it's not a purely business thing. I very much, I am pro-business, and I think business can be very effective, But one of the preoccupations in Mercosur was to have councils that unite the trade unions, that unite other sectors of the organized society. And that's the reason why we're, in some cases we have already, in some cases we are discussing, social security agreements that allow people, many people spoke about people-to-people contact. What's better in terms of people-to-people contact than allow someone who paid its social security in one country to complete in another country? And that, I think, is something that the Pacific Alliance, even because it's new, but I don't know if it's one of its purposes, but certainly it's one of the purposes of Mercosur. Thirdly, in an expanded way, considering UNASUR, we are discussing a common defense approach. Let me say not a doctrine, but at least a common defense approach, which again is something that brings us closer from the European Union. Let me say also that we have inscribed in our actions the idea of solidarity. So we have, I think we are, I don't know about the ASEAN very well, but we are one of the few developing countries integration processes that has something which is similar to the European Union also, by it's called the FOSEM, it's a fund by which the countries that can have more money can finance projects in the smaller countries. And I'm not speaking of something very abstract. For instance, there is a transmission line between Itaipu and Asunción, which was totally financed by that. There are roads in Uruguay that were also financed by that process. So in that respect, the political aspect, the integration aspect, is very much present in Mercosur in a way in which it is not yet. Maybe in the future it will be. I think the idea that we represent about 80% of the population, maybe 75% or 70% of the GDP of South America, to South America. Well, and maybe 50% or a little more of the whole of Latin America. Well, I don't have the precise figures now, but it's not very far from that, maybe 40%. So imagine that the 40% would be rotating around the 20% is something difficult to imagine. But in any case, I want to stress one thing. And that I think it's valid for both sides, we shouldn't see these things as non-complementarity, because the worst thing that could happen in Latin America would be a division between, let us say, a Pacific, or the conception of a division between a Pacific alliance, which is pro-business, pro-capitalist, pro-trade, free, and so on, and an Atlantic alliance, or whatever, a South Atlantic alliance, that would be state-controlled, or whatever people in other countries which are not very familiar with the situation like to say. So I think this would be a big danger, because that would put in danger our biggest advantage, which is being peaceful. That's probably the biggest thing that South America has, and I don't think we should toy with that.
Thank you very much. And I'll give 1 minute each to each of the other panelists, perhaps to respond to the Maritime Silk Road idea and anything else that they thought important. But Pak Marty first.
Thank you very much, John. Conscious of the time limitation, just want to reinforce one point first, that agenda setting, in this instance, agenda setting for Trans-Pacific cooperation, is not a procedural issue only. It is also a substantive, politically laden decision. So whatever agenda that one chooses to discuss within the Trans-Pacific, it must be one that has comfort level among all the various parties concerned, whether it be countries or regional organizations. That is why, just now, I suggested at the beginning, we must take stock of what we have at the moment and ensure that the kind of Trans-Pacific agenda that we promote is one where there is already a building blocks within the Pacific, where we simply connect the outer dots. And our friend just now highlighted one possible area, which is maritime dimension. If you look at the Pacific in terms of geography, obviously, water, the ocean, constitute a huge proportion of our geographic space, and therefore cooperation in the maritime domain is a key element. And here ASEAN, again, has taken the lead in our neighborhood through the ASEAN Maritime Forum, which we have expanded to the so-called expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum to include the non-ASEAN East Asian countries. And I can see a situation where a maritime discussion can be made Pacific-wide, whether it be on environment, disaster response, fisheries, security, and many others. And just now, our friend, the distinguished former Foreign Minister of Brazil, had mentioned, one area in the security domain, nuclear non-proliferation. We have just now a number of nuclear-free zones, starting from Tlatelolco in South America, Rarotonga in South Pacific, Southeast Asia, the Bangkok Treaty in Southeast Asia. If we were to connect the outer dots, then we will have a complete zone of security linking up our oceans. And by the way, Indonesia just now is also working hard to promote the so-called Indo-Pacific initiative, linking the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And just now, our colleague spoke of the Atlantic Ocean. So there is actually a sufficient body of possibilities in promoting inter-ocean cooperation. But again, agenda is not a procedural issue. We have to have a good degree of comfort level amongst all countries concerned that these are the type of step-by-step cooperation we can be promoting. Thank you, John.
Lior Boon.
I'll just very quickly touch on the SMEs. I think SMEs, like all businesses, the biggest problem is uncertainty and the unknown unknowns. So if governments, we can come in, help them bridge some of these information gaps, I think then we allow them to better facilitate and think of the ideas. And one concrete way is really across the region just to establish partnerships, because as SMEs, you do not have resources to expand overseas very quickly. So if you can find a right partner, that's the first step. And over the medium to longer term, then you could consider direct investments and expanding the SMEs franchise beyond that.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to draw this discussion to a close because in about 12 minutes we want to have our closing address, which will be delivered by President Varela of Panama. We have to do a brief staging break here. I want to thank our four panelists for their effort to look forward to a Trans-Pacific agenda. I think one of the conclusions I draw from this discussion, and we'll need to compare the discussions that we had also in our breakout groups and the like, is that there's still an awful lot of work to do in the area of bilateral relations between the various countries of the Pacific. Each of them still have their own agenda. I think there's some important points that have been made about connectivity, B2B relations, and potentially stronger experience sharing activity between specifically ASEAN and the Pacific Alliance. And perhaps more discussion between the Pacific Alliance and ASEAN is one pragmatic suggestion that can come out of this forum. I know that under the Mexican presidency of the Pacific Alliance, there are more efforts to engage ASEAN as an organization in dialogue with the Pacific Alliance. The Pacific Alliance is 3 years old. ASEAN has been around for some time. There's been some missed opportunities in ASEAN. There's been some processes of enlargement of ASEAN that also caused challenges in the early days. As the Pacific Alliance is looking at an accession process and as convergence criteria and relating the Pacific Alliance to other institutions in South America and Latin America generally. Some of the experiences of ASEAN in engaging ASEAN +3 and ASEAN with other parts of the region, I think are intriguing lessons for the Pacific Alliance to learn. So my conclusion from this last session is that more information sharing between the Pacific Alliance and ASEAN, ASEAN to the Pacific Alliance is one pragmatic way forward in establishing pragmatically more trans-Pacific dialogue in understanding shared experiences. And Mercosur and ASEAN, I'm sure, also benefited from that. From that dialogue. So thank you very much indeed. Please thank the four speakers, and we'll just come back here in 12 minutes for our concluding address.